All right, hello everyone. My name is Christian. I'll be presenting my experiment, the interaction between learning task and the DTR effect. So what is the DTR effect? Basically, the DTR effect is we found that when you think about death, it sort of temporarily improves your memory of events that are occurring when you're thinking about death. And the purpose of my experiment was to explain, well, why does this happen? But before I can do that, I just need to give you some sort of general background on the information. So first, in psychology, when we are talking about thoughts of death, we generally call that mortality salience. And for the sake of my lips, I'm just going to call that MS for the rest of this presentation. And also, when we are testing people's memory, we usually will give subjects a list of words, and then we'll test how well they can remember those words. But we can present the words in two ways. We can tell them, hey, here's this list of words, now try and remember this for later. Or we can present them a list of words, have them do some sort of distractor task with the words, and then give them the memory test later as a surprise. Now this is the types of learning task. Intentional learning task means that we told them ahead of time. Incidental learning task means it comes as a surprise. And then lastly, when subjects are trying to remember these words, they can perform two types of processing on the words, item-specific and relational. Item-specific processing is when the subjects remember each of the words as sort of distinct and unique in its own way. Whereas relational processing is where they remember the connections between different words and how one word leads to another. So as some background research, this whole thing started in 2007 when Nairn et al. Published a paper on the survival memory effect. What they found was that when they gave subjects a list of words and asked them to rate the words as to how relevant they were in a survival situation, they found that those subjects performed significantly better on memory tests than on a control group. So what this suggests is that our brain systems have evolved to remember information that is very relevant to our survival, which makes sense. But then in 2012, my mentor, Daniel Burns, and a colleague, Dr. Hart, I believe, thought, well, if survival is just the avoidance of death, is it actually death that's improving your memory? And so they conducted a study where they primed subjects with thoughts of death, and they found that this does also improve memory, and they called this the dying to remember effect. And then the next year, Burns and a bunch of other scientists published a paper linking the two effects. They found that the underlying mechanisms between the two effects actually overlap, and that they're caused by essentially the same thing. And just as a last little tidbit here, when you're trying to measure the amounts of processing subjects are undergoing, you can plot their cumulative recall curves. So you see how many words they recalled at 1 minute, how many words they recalled at 2 minutes, 3 minutes, so on, all the way up to 10 minutes. And you can see changes over time depending on the types of processing. So for this first slide, the black dots are subjects who had high relational processing, and the white dots are subjects who had high item-specific processing. So what you can see is that the relational subjects have initially very high spike, but then they taper off quickly, whereas the item-specific subjects, they don't initially spike as high, but they also don't taper off as quick, so they eventually end up at the same level of recall. But over here you can see that if subjects can do both types of processing, they get the benefits of both. So they get the high spike of the relational and the lack of the tapering off from item-specific. So for my test, I was trying to see whether learning task would alter the dying to remember effect. So I tested 198 students from this high school. I obtained informed consent from them and their parents before I tested them, and I split them into 4 different groups: MS intentional, MS incidental, MS control intentional, and control incidental. Now, I hypothesized that overall MS would do better than control on the recall test because of the dying to remember effect. However, I theorized that intentional would be greater than incidental for control groups because the intentional groups would know to remember the words and they would be rehearsing them, but not for the death groups because they would be too distracted by thoughts of death to effectively rehearse. All right, so first I gave subjects a self-monitoring scale. What the self-monitoring scale is measuring how much do the subjects are aware of how their actions affect in their social environment. And I included this as a control factor on my results because it is believed that high self-monitors think about death differently than low self-monitors. However, it eventually turned out that this had no effect on my results at all. Then I primed the subjects with either thoughts of death or a control task in which I primed them with thoughts of dental pain. So what I had is I gave them a sheet of paper and it said, what kinds of emotions does the thought of death arouse in you, and what do you imagine will happen to you as you physically die? For the control groups, I replaced the words death with dental pain to provide something equally negative. Then I gave them a positive and negative effect scale to measure how negative they were feeling, basically, to make sure that there was no difference between the death and control. Then I gave the subjects a category sorting task. So what I did is I had a list of words, and I presented them one at a time on a PowerPoint, much like this. And beneath each word was a list of categories, and I had the subjects sort the words into categories. This served two purposes. The first purpose was to provide a distractor task for my incidental groups. The second purpose was to provide a baseline level of relational processing for all the subjects. Then I gave the subject a 10-minute cumulative recall test. So here I have shown the means of my groups, and this doesn't really tell us much other than the fact that the control incidental group had a pretty lower mean than the rest of the subjects. So then with the help of my mentor, I did some statistical analyses on my results. So if you look in this significance column over here, any number that is below 0.05 is considered statistically significant. So I plotted this at 10 minutes and 2 minutes in lieu of my cumulative recall curves. And what I found was that there was a significant difference between intentional and incidental at both time points, but not a difference between death and control. And then when analyzing the interaction between the two, it was approaching significance, but it wasn't quite there yet. So then I looked further into my results, and I said, okay, is there a difference between death and control given just one type of learning task? And what I found at 10 minutes and 2 minutes is that there was a difference, or almost a difference, in the incidental groups, but there was no difference in the intentional groups. So what this suggests is that the intentional subjects were not being able to fully prime with thoughts of death because they were too busy rehearsing, so I actually kind of had it backwards. So just a quick summary, overall intentional was greater than incidental, and death was greater than control, only for the incidental groups, but not for the intentional groups. And this difference was larger at 2 minutes, which suggests that there was more relational processing among the death subjects. So these results approach significance because this dying to remember effect is actually a quite small effect. It's not actually useful if you wanted to try and study for a final or something, but it's just kind of interesting to see how the brain works under these situations. So another reason that I feel like my results weren't quite as significant as my mentors was that my subjects were much younger, and I was much younger, so I didn't have as much authority over them. I had a lot of trouble getting them to stay focused when I was testing them. I often had to have a teacher with me to get them to quiet down. And also when I was reading their responses to the priming questions, I found that they weren't thinking all that hard. They just said, oh, I would feel sad, my family would cry, it was not they weren't really getting into it. And so I felt like they didn't really get the dying to remember effect because they weren't really truly thinking about death on an emotional level. So in the future, first of all, there is likely an interaction between learned task and the DTR effect because we did find that it was present under incidental, but not under intentional. However, I would like to design a new test, testing the dying to remember effect on young subjects versus old subjects. So for example, are the young subjects unable to fully grasp the concept of death, or was it just I was not able to get them to pay attention? And this is something that I could do in the future, maybe when I go into college and stuff. So I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Daniel Burns of Union College. I'd like to thank Mr. Judd for all the help he's given me. I'd like to thank my mom for helping me sort through all those surveys that I asked my subjects. And I'd like to thank you all for being here and watching all these presentations. All right, that's it.